Okay, we're going to start looking at stakeholder management now, and let's start off by actually deciding, who a stakeholder is, what stakeholders are. And I've got a definition here of stakeholders being any group or person within or outside the organisation that has some type of investment or interest in the organisation's performance and is affected or potentially affected by the organisation's actions. So it could be employees, it could be customers, it could be shareholders, it could be neighbours near where the business is based, and so on. Now, each stakeholder has a different criterion for responsiveness because it has a different interest in the organisation. And this is something we'll be talking about on the video, but actually we'll be looking at in more detail with more examples as we look at this in the class next week. So if we move on to stakeholders again, and again we're thinking about stakeholders being individuals and groups who are affected by the activities of the organisation. And it's important to remember that actually they could be internal to the organisation in terms of things like your directors, your employees, or they could actually be external, things perhaps like community groups or the government. And I've got some examples here of shareholders, the financial bodies, because it's quite likely the businesses borrow money, employees, trade unions, managers, government, customers, suppliers, community groups and the environment. Now there's two types of stakeholders to bear in mind, and first of all there's primary stakeholders, and the primary stakeholders, this is where there's the need for their ongoing support for the company. It's vital for the survival of the business, and these stakeholders commonly have some contractual or financial relationship with the company, perhaps as shareholders or employees. The government could be a primary stakeholder in some instances, and if you were something like a mining company, the company is dependent upon the government permission to actually carry out that mining work. Then there's secondary stakeholders. Now secondary stakeholders have a much less direct impact on the company, but I think it's important to understand that sometimes a secondary stakeholder could actually become a primary stakeholder if conditions change. So for example, if you think of a local community group and by itself it's actually quite small and it's powerless and it has very little impact on your business. But if there's more support and it has a legal argument, it could quickly become a primary stakeholder. And therefore for a business it's important to remember that all stakeholders are important, but the degree to which they're prioritised may change depending on the factors and the circumstances. So if we actually start to identify who these stakeholders are, and if we actually look at the past and ongoing engagement, who actually are we working with? Who have we worked with in the past? Who are we working with now? And to look at the potential new stakeholders, new markets. I think when we first sort of start brainstorming to work out who these are, it's important to actually think very diversely and also think very socially, and to be aware though that perhaps sometimes the loudest voices aren't always the one most worth listening to. If we started to try and analyse these, think about the contribution they provide. What do they know? What could they add to the business? Their legitimacy. Are they actually a stakeholder? Are they really a primary stakeholder? How willing are they to engage? And perhaps if they aren't willing to engage, do we need to get them to engage? And how can we do that? How much influence do they have? If we think about sometimes like community groups, they may have a lot of influence in the fact as local councillors form part of them, which influence the way local government might look at something. And also necessity. If we don't actually engage with them, then what will actually happen if we ignore them? So why do we actually want to engage with stakeholders? And I think responsible companies want to understand and respond to society's expectations of what it means to be a responsible manufacturer, a responsible marketer, a responsible employer. Engagement is a very good opportunity to actually build better relationships with all parties. And the result of these better relationships, actually it could very well have a way of improving the business planning and perhaps the business performance. I think as well it's important to remember that engagement provides opportunities to align business practices with societal needs and expectations, and it can actually help drive long-term sustainability and shareholder value. Stakeholder mapping. Need to really understand this concept of mapping, and it's a case of actually looking to see, well, who is our stakeholder? It's a systematic way of identifying expectations, the needs, the importance and relative power of various stakeholders, which may change over time. So thinking, well, who are the stakeholders? What their contribution can be? How much influence they have? And whether they're likely to get involved. And at that stage, we actually then need to try to make a judgment about who we need to focus our attention on. And if we're thinking about our tactics and our strategy, actually deciding what we need to do. So stakeholder mapping is a really important process for managers to understand. And I've just got here a stakeholder power interest grid. Now if we look upon this grid from the top, we actually have the levels of interest ranging from low and ranging from high. And if we look on the left hand side, we have the power level, whether it's low or whether it's high. So we have some stakeholders who have very much a high interest and a high power level or a high impact level on your business. And these sort of stakeholders we actually really need to manage closely. We need to be encouraging them, we need to be motivating them, we need to be getting them to work with us. Now some stakeholders may have a really high power level, but actually they're not particularly interested in your business. And these sort of people we're actually looking at keeping satisfied. Then we can actually see we have stakeholders who have a low level of power, a low influence, a low impact, but actually they've got a really high level of interest in the business and actually would keep those informed. And then we have some stakeholders who have not much interest in the business and not much power, but they are still stakeholders. And what we'll be doing in class this week is we'll actually be looking at some specific examples. So I think just to summarise up, strategic management is very much concerning determining the overall direction of the organisation. We've been discussing this over several weeks now. It has to be done with an understanding of the overall business environment, and the stakeholder groups will frequently impact on the way a business chooses to operate. It's really important for managers to understand stakeholder groups in order to better accommodate their needs.